very late where I am. And on that note, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Whadjuk Noongar Boodja or Whadjuk Noongar country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So today I'm talking to you about human rights and atrocity crimes, which is my chapter in the Oxford Handbook. So atrocity crimes are often also referred to as mass human rights violations, and indeed atrocity crimes are human rights violations. Study of conduct that's carried out during mass atrocities demonstrates that there is an overlap of behaviour that can be categorised as atrocity crimes, for example, war crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, and that which can be categorised as human rights violations. Now, atrocity crimes are represented in the legal regime of international humanitarian law, which regulates conduct in armed conflict, including prohibiting war crimes, and that of international criminal law, as we know, things like the statutes of international criminal courts and tribunals. Human rights are represented and regulated in the vast international human rights law system, which consists of a significant number of human rights treaties, including those that are listed on my slide here. It also consists of things like the United Nations treaty bodies and other UN mechanisms like the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Human Rights Council. Now, both human rights law and international criminal law are also enacted into domestic law, albeit in very different ways. But the system of human rights used for a state accountability is less frequently used for atrocity crimes. Now, despite this separation in praxis of the two regimes, there is an inherent connection between atrocities and human rights. Human rights treaties have a really broad scope, obligating states to uphold human rights. The human rights regime is a form of prevention, a specific mechanism of protection during atrocities, and also a system of accountability for state crimes. Thus, it is vital to connect atrocities with human rights before, during and after atrocities. So I wanted to take a look now at how the three atrocity crime categories overlap with human rights. Now, crimes against humanity include some of the most serious human rights violations, many of which appear in not only general human rights treaties, but also in specialised human rights treaties. So, for example, apartheid, torture, enforced disappearance, and persecution. Therefore, the role of human rights is fundamental as it provides a means for regulating state behaviour through obligations not to commit such violations, and also a mechanism for state accountability through treaty and sometimes customary international law. For example, the prohibition on torture is considered customary international law. Now, the role of human rights in the crimes against humanity context is particularly important because while there are many international instruments regulating the law of armed conflict, and as we all know, there is a convention that specifically prescribes genocide, there's no international instrument dealing with crimes against humanity. Now, crimes against humanity appear in the statutes of international criminal courts and tribunals, but a standalone treaty for crimes against humanity does not exist. And obviously what we get here is now a lacuna in which states actually cannot be held accountable for the commission of crimes against humanity. Now, there is a project underway involving the International Law Commission to draft a Crimes Against Humanity Convention. But of course, as with all treaty drafting and negotiations, it's an ongoing and very lengthy process. So basically what this means is there's no means for state accountability for crimes against humanity, and therefore the human rights regime that regulates very similar crimes is quite crucial here. Let's take a look now at war crimes. So war crimes are violations of international humanitarian law, otherwise known as the laws of war or the law of armed conflict. Now, much has been written about the intersection between human rights and IHL, probably because of the extensive system of law that exists for IHL and for human rights. And an equal of this doesn't exist for genocide or crimes against humanity. In addition, human rights thinking has significantly influenced the development of IHL. After all, both regimes are about the protection of people. Now, there have been human rights cases before regional and international bodies, such as the European Court of Human Rights and other UN human rights bodies, that have actually heard cases relating to human rights during armed conflict. And in some cases, they have actually considered IHL when they're making their decisions. So ultimately, human rights do still apply in times of armed conflict. However, IHL is what we call a lex specialis. So this means law governing a specific subject matter. And this means that IHL will override any general law that exists at the time of armed conflict. The International Court of Justice has held that human rights protections do not cease in times of war, and that these protections apply extraterritorially, meaning they apply outside the state's territory. So, but that said, states are actually permitted to derogate from some human rights in an emergency, and of course, armed conflict certainly counts as an emergency. So in a situation where some particular human rights may not apply because they're being derogated from, IHL can step in and fill that gap. Now, one really interesting difference in the relationship between human rights protection and war crimes prohibition that doesn't occur with other atrocity crimes is that killing is permissible in armed conflict. Now, war crimes include, as you can see on the slide here, willful killing in international armed conflict and murder in non-international armed conflict. These are very specifically worded provisions based on the fact that arbitrary deprivation of life is prohibited during armed conflict. Therefore, IHL allows for people to be killed. So basically, IHL is designed to reduce human suffering and protect civilians, but it also allows for military necessity, which may include killing hostile forces. So this means that the non-derogability of the right to life applies strictly during armed conflict only to the concept of arbitrary deprivation of life, not deprivation of life generally, exempting wartime killing for military necessity, particularly in self-defense, from this human rights regulation. So the International Court of Justice has held that the test of what is an arbitrary deprivation of life falls to be determined by the applicable lex specialis, namely IHL. So even though here we see human rights is the origin of the right to freedom from arbitrary deprivation of life, it is IHL and not human rights law that is the test for what amounts to arbitrary deprivation of life during armed conflict. Let's now have a look at genocide and human rights. Now, genocide prevention has evolved separately from the human rights system. Indeed, the Genocide Convention does not actually fit within the international human rights system. The international human rights system began at the same time as the Genocide Convention with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it continued with other treaties such as those I listed on my first slide. Now, human rights treaties have human rights bodies within the UN that are tasked with overseeing the interpretation and implementation of those treaties. These bodies work with states to ensure that treaty obligations are correctly and comprehensively implemented at a domestic level. But in contrast, the Genocide Convention is not a human rights treaty. Rather, it's actually a crime suppression treaty akin to other transnational crime suppression treaties, such as those seeking to criminalise and regulate, for example, organised crime or trafficking in persons. Crime suppression treaties obligate states to criminalise particular transnational or international crimes. These are generally very straightforward obligations that are easy to implement through domestic criminal law provisions. Now, in contrast, human rights treaties have a much broader scope under which states are obligated to uphold specific rights, and the implementation of which can actually involve quite extensive conduct and action on the part of the state. Now, as genocide scholars, we all know that genocide is a process, and my research has found that there is a particular pattern of specific human rights violations throughout the genocide process, as indicated in this slide. Now, when this particular pattern of human rights violations occur, we can use it to assume that the situation is at risk of genocide occurring, or rather that it is in the middle of the process. So basically, this paradigm is a means of midstream prevention, where the genocide process has begun, but can be recognised and stopped before it reaches the extreme end of the process, in other words, the physical violence phase. So from this, we can see there's a need to use the existing human rights mechanisms in the UN to recognise this kind of pattern of rights violations, and then to act to further prevent violations and crimes through expressly stating that there is a genocide risk and using that mechanism's power to take action, but also to push other states to take action against the genocidal regime. This would aim to prevent the genocide process from progressing further along the spectrum. Now, entities such as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and special rapporteurs, for example, can draw attention specifically to these patterns. They can engage with states to stop violating human rights, and they can call for action to be taken by other bodies within the UN, like the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, or even the Security Council. Now, in addition to these measures, the more regular processes, namely the treaty bodies meetings and the Universal Periodic Review through the Human Rights Council, they enable action to be taken in the state's regular reporting hearings. Rather than referring generally to some rights violations, these UN entities can and should draw attention to these particular human rights violation patterns, noting the connection to the genocide process, and then work with states to reverse and cease these particular rights violations. Thus, although the Genocide Convention is not part of the human rights system, there is a specific way in which human rights bodies and entities can contribute to genocide prevention. By recognising the rights violation patterns that are consistent with the genocide process as a specific genocide risk prediction factor, human rights entities within the system can act, collaborate with states to ensure that the genocide process is halted before the physical violence takes over and the target group is physically exterminated. So basically, there's a clear need for more interaction and cooperation between the human rights and international criminal justice systems. While there are aspects of the international criminal justice process that directly engage with human rights, so for example, fair trial rights, it's far less prevalent for substantive application and analysis of atrocity crimes to be intertwined with application and analysis of human rights. The human rights system and the International Court of Justice need to be used more frequently for state responsibility for human rights abuses during mass atrocities. Now, the ICJ has dealt with violations of human rights in IHL, but when it heard cases relating to the Genocide Convention, these cases did not also allege violations of human rights treaties. The importance of the human rights legal regime is particularly crucial, as I mentioned, with regards to crimes against humanity, because with no crimes against humanity treaty and with debate persisting over the customary international law status of crimes against humanity, human rights obligations are actually the only means of ensuring that we have state accountability for crimes against humanity, particularly, for example, say, the human right to freedom from torture. Now, in addition to this, violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, for example, the right to health, as atrocities, these tend to be ignored by international criminal courts and tribunals in favour of atrocities that are violations of civil and political rights, for example, freedom from torture. But prosecutors need to consider the impact of violations of economic, social, and cultural rights as equally as important as violations of civil and political rights. So generally and significantly, the human rights regime is one that helps to prevent atrocities. It's a holistic regime. It's a system that provides a base of behaviour to ensure human dignity. So the implementation of rights creates an equitable society that's inclusive, it's peaceful, it's considerate, it's generous, and it's rules-based. And such a society is far less likely to disintegrate into atrocities. Hence, the human rights regime mixes with atrocities. as a form of prevention, a means of protection during times of atrocities, and a system that provides a means of accountability for states. We need to bring international crimes and human rights systems closer together to create a symbiotic system of both prevention and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Brien. That was fantastic and right on time. We will continue moving on to our next presenter. And then again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Hopefully, as we move forward, this will continue to work. Oh, perfect. Here's our next presenter. So Maartje Weedesteijn is going to be talking with us about atrocities and regime type, and specifically talking through some of these complex dynamics. As I mentioned at the outset, or for those of you who were not here as our session began, the handbook begins with thinking about how we think about atrocity crimes, and Dr. O'Brien just walked us through an example of this. It also then proceeds to address the causes of atrocity crimes, and regime type is certainly one that is considered often, but as Dr. Weedesteijn is going to tell us, often hampered by a lot of different difficulties with how we actually conceive of and operationalize regime type. So I will turn it over to my colleague and another co-editor of the volume for her 15-minute presentation.
Maartje, you're
I
still
believe
on
you're
mute.
still muted.
That should be better then.
Better, perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is all a bit new to me, and I noticed that if I go back to the conference screen, you will get this effect of seeing me over and over and over again, as well as my screen. So I'll leave it at this. Thank you, Hollie, for the introduction. It is really exciting for me to be here as well, because of course it's also a celebratory moment that the handbook is almost done. The chapter that I wrote aims to do two things. The first is to provide an overview of the state of the art on the literature that analyzes the relationship between regime type and the likelihood that genocide and mass atrocities occur. And secondly, I want to try to push the debate forward by combining insights from both qualitative as well as quantitative strands of literature on this topic, which I think is a need for. And in order to get that going, I will first delve into some of the definitions which are out there that actually I think hamper the comparability of the existing work that has been developed in the different disciplines. Thereafter, I'll move to the state of the art of the field, and then I'll further explain the relationship and how I think we can move this debate forward. So first, the debate on the relationship between violence and regime type is complicated because scholars actually analyze different types of violence and use various definitions for that violence. So some scholars, as of course I think this audience is very well aware, they will use labels such as genocide, but also politicide, which came into being because, strictly speaking, the genocide definition in the convention doesn't cover political groups, but also democide, which, for instance, Rommel uses as an even wider term to encompass both genocide as well as politicide. But there are also other terms that are used and out there that are meant to signify and denote massive violence of various seriousness. So, for instance, Crane refers to state-sponsored mass murder, but you can also think of terms like mass killings that signify the illegitimacy of the violence. Not everybody uses a very high fatality threshold, so some scholars like Kreutz deliberately choose a relatively lower fatality threshold. And Fine, for instance, also doesn't only focus on massive violence. She's very specific, pointing at a fourfold categorization where the biological and social integrity of persons and groups is violated, referring to them as life integrity violations. Then the research into repression, I think, is worthwhile mentioned separately, because this includes an even wider array of acts and will encompass both a violation of civil liberties as well as human rights. Many of the human rights violations discussed in these various works will amount to atrocity crimes, and they may constitute either war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. But I think, as Dr. O'Brien so eloquently described earlier, not all of them will, especially if you focus on repression and human rights violations, especially when they're isolated incidents, are not perpetrated in a widespread or systematic manner, or occur outside of the context of war. They do not necessarily amount to international crimes or atrocity crimes. So while all of these strands of literature analyze the relationship that regime types, so democratic versus dictatorial regimes, have with violence, they focus in fact on quite diverging concepts. To complicate the matter even further, also the definitions of regime type actually are quite disparate and different. And if you would look at the term democracy, strictly speaking, it comes from the Greek word demokratia, which is composed of the word for people and for rule or power, kratos. So people being demos and rule or power, kratos. And throughout much of its history, the concept referred to more of a struggle that results for competing interests. So I'm going all the way back to its origins and wasn't necessarily looked upon positively. And this actually only changed in the last 2 centuries. And there's also a difference among the extent to which democracy is consolidated and how it is actually conceptualized. So if you look at procedural or electoral democracy, there's actually not much of a relationship with human rights. There's no innate reason to think that it would further human rights. But if you look at liberal democracy, for instance, that is often conceptualized also encompassing the rule of law, protection of minorities, and there you see that actually, per definition, it has a positive connection to human rights. Then turning the other side of the coin, going to illiberal democracy, it was actually developed as a concept to also show that there are democracies that are not necessarily upholding these human rights standards, and that human rights violations may go hand to hand with sort of electoral processes. So these regimes that are neither fully democratic or fully dictatorial, they're often referred to as these hybrid regimes. So liberal democracy you could see as a concept of that. And some scholars have warned that this typology of hybrid regimes, of different hybrid regimes, almost leads to more confusion than it enlightens. So there are so many synonyms with slight subtleties that actually becomes more of a problem, and regimes are conceptualized as either being more or less authoritarian or more or less democratic. Then the same, I would say, actually goes for dictatorship, tyranny, despotism, and autocracy. If you go to the origins of the concept of dictatorship, it's actually interesting that in terms of morality, it has the complete opposite direction as democracy. Democracy started out negative, now carries a positive connotation, but dictatorship used to have actually a positive connotation, being a constitutional provision in ancient Rome, meant to last for no longer than 6 months, and as a way for the leader to save Rome from threats. And it has only become more negative with the rule of Sulla and Caesar, where their reign became described as more tyrannical. And tyranny, actually, in his definition, has been associated with unjust rule and brutal rule, illegally, so illegitimately exercising power, and is more permanent than the dictatorship originally was. The leader there is very much at the forefront. And that's also where this concept of tyrannicide came from, because it provides a particular legitimacy, again, going back to its origins of eliminating this awful leader to save the country. This, again, is quite different from despotism, which has much more of a connotation of being grounded in law and custom of different cultures and societies. And the same holds true for autocracy, which is often referred to more as kingdoms and hereditary regimes. More recent conceptualizations of non-democratic rules, such as totalitarian, authoritarian regimes, those are more of actually a different type of non-democratic regime, and they were developed, of course, after the Second World War and afterwards, where, especially with the totalitarian regime, it was found that this new, with Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, that new forms of non-democratic regimes deserved new conceptualizations. Then there are also the quantitative measures. I can just mention Polity4 database being influential, but also, of course, the Freedom House Index, the Autocratic Regime database, and all of these have different measures, different qualifications, usually moving away from this distinction of that there's dictatorship and democracy to also highlight more subtle differences between the different regimes. And the database that I mentioned earlier of Geddes, Wright, and France is particularly interesting because it allows also to analyze transition. So these are the other side of the definitional landscape that scholars have quite often referred to. Now, this has recently been suggested that this complicates matters quite significantly, because then there is a tautological component in there, especially if you would look, for instance, at liberal democracy, where, again, the respect of human rights is very much inherent to the concept you're looking at, and, for instance, tyranny, which already has this very brutal component tied to its conceptualization. So that is important to keep in mind, I think, if you're trying to understand this broader field. Nonetheless, scholars have taken up this challenge, and the debate has been between those scholars who find that more dictatorial regimes are actually more repressive, such as Rummel, versus other scholars, amongst whom Helen Fine, who suggested there's more murder in the middle, meaning that these semi-democratic or semi-authoritarian regimes that are in a phase of transitioning actually are more at risk of having mass atrocities. Recently, I think the debate actually has become much more sophisticated, where scholars have also looked, for instance, at which elements of democracy are actually important for safeguarding human rights and preventing mass atrocities, and also at which level of democracy, so the extent to consolidation that is required for it to matter. Now, ultimately, what I think is the consensus in this large body of scholarship is that consolidated democratic regimes are the safest to live in, and the risk of mass atrocities is least in these consolidated democracies. So that's where all of this scholarship, I would say, meets. When this relationship is explained, actually, a lot of scholars rely on the idea of rational choice component, in the sense that the accountability mechanisms are such in a democratic regimes that the costs of not upholding these human rights standards and of the perpetration of mass atrocities, that they are less likely engaged in them. But also, again, the protection of minorities in democratic states has been mentioned, but also socialization of the elites, in particular values. Now, again, I said I wanted to take this debate one step further, and in doing so, I think it's important to look at the risk factors for atrocities that we all know as genocide scholars. So in doing so, I look at two particular risk factors that have previously also been analyzed separately. So difficult life conditions and war I take together in scholarship. They've often also been disentangled, as well as a history of violence and a plural society. The reason why I think it's important to sort of combine the difficult life conditions and war is because, of course, one can emerge from the other. War very often amounts to difficult life conditions. And then if you look at the relationship between these risk factors and dictators, what you can see is that the dictators can have a very much of an influence over these risk factors. They can create difficult life conditions. They can also be a result of their poor management over their country, because their priorities lies with maintaining loyalty in the elite and not necessarily the well-being of their citizens. But they can also actively utilize it for their own power bases, for instance, by creating famines in different parts of the population as part of a repressive strategies. And then if you look at war, research has found that overall, it seems that dictatorial regimes more often engage in warfare, in the sense that when there are warring factions, very often at least one party is a dictatorial regime, and also within the country, democracies are more guarded to accept excesses on their own territory. At least this does not necessarily translate to the territory of another country. So you see here that when it comes to difficult life conditions, there is a particular element in dictatorial regimes that will make these life conditions such that actually the risk that they already pose becomes even greater when they occur in a non-democratic regime. And when you look at the history of violence and plural society, it has been mentioned by Cooper at the time that a plural society is an important risk factor for genocide. And while there has been some debate back and forth, there is reason to believe that, especially when there is a discrimination against a particular group and a demonization against a political group, that the risks of mass atrocities do quite significantly increase. And dictatorial regimes, through their influence over their country's also landscape in terms of narrative and the lack of free media, they do have an important, more of an influence over that than democratic regimes. And the history of violence can then be used and manipulated by dictatorial leaders to present a picture that will be demonizing towards one group, because literature states that ideologies are not, and propaganda doesn't necessarily is so influential unless there is a basis on which it can be tied to, which this history of violence can provide. So again, you see, because of the nature of dictatorial regime, where there's a dominant voice that can be imposed upon society, in which a particular group can be demonized, that when these factors occur in a non-democratic regime, they pose an even greater risk factor to the perpetration of mass atrocities. So then I come to my conclusion, and much has been said about the relationship between the democratic or dictatorial nature of a regime and the implication this has for human rights violations and atrocity crimes. But it's not always comparable research. Scholars have different disparate terms and definitions of the types of regimes and crimes that they analyze, and therefore there are also scattered conclusions. And I think the scholarship could gain from more interaction between the quantitative and qualitative strands of literature that are out there, also in the broader sense in the field of genocide studies when it comes to the risk factors that have been analyzed and identified by other scholars. So these conferences, I think, are the perfect place to start, and I hope I did my part towards that aim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weedesteijn. I am going to make Dr. Erin Jesse the presenter. Okay, wonderful. While Dr. Jesse is getting the PowerPoint ready, just really quickly, another part of the handbook looks at the actors involved in atrocity crimes, both the victimization and the harm, and of course the individuals who perpetrate this violence. And one of my absolute favorite chapters in the entire volume is Dr. Jesse's, because it really looks at role shifting and how oftentimes this atrocity triangle that we like to speak of in our discipline is not really as clear cut as we often think it is. So I will turn it over to Dr. Jesse to walk us through her chapter, which draws extensively on her fantastic fieldwork in Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Holly. And no PowerPoint presentation from me. I'm actually just going to talk about the chapter. If there's anybody out there, though, who, of course, wants some additional notes, that kind of thing, please feel free to get in touch with me via email. I'm happy to share what I've prepared for today. And thank you, Holly, for the introduction. And more broadly, thank you so much to the editors of the Oxford Handbook on Atrocity Crimes for organizing this panel. And of course, the edited volume, more generally, it's been a really fantastic team to work with, and just contains a really impressive array of chapters from some really excellent scholars. So I know I'm really looking forward to assigning it in my classes, citing it in my research, and so on. And I hope other people will find it similarly useful. For my part today, I'm just going to talk about the chapter that I've contributed to this edited volume, which is inspired very much by a desire to move beyond these overly simplistic categories of actors that Holly has referenced here, that tend to surround episodes of genocide and mass atrocities. And of course, this is a dichotomy or a trichotomy that persists not only in academic research, but tends to be especially prevalent in popular culture internationally, the way that we talk about these crimes in the media, for example. And in this chapter, I'm effectively arguing that by perpetuating distinct separations between survivors, bystanders, perpetrators, and occasionally there's other commonly cited categories of actors, we risk inadvertently promoting an overly simplistic view of how genocides and other atrocity crimes emerge within a society, how they transform people's lives, and also the long-term legacies that they can have for entire societies in the post-atrocity period. And furthermore, I found at times that this overly simplistic framing has the potential to undermine stated benefits of transitional justice initiatives that are aimed at promoting social repair, and on an individual level can perpetuate lasting harms for the people and the communities they're part of who've endured this kind of genocidal or mass atrocity related violence. So this chapter is really an attempt to begin to address these concerns. It's grounded in decades of other people's research in the fields of Holocaust studies, genocide studies, conflict studies, and so on. And really it's arguing for taking as a starting point this idea that people whose lives have been intimately affected by genocide and other mass atrocities are a kind of complex political actor. And I should stress, I mean, this is really something I'm arguing as a starting point for analysis. It doesn't necessarily have to be where we end It's a term that in particular is merging the work of two political scientists, one being Erica Burris, who sort of coined the term complex political victim, and the other being Erin Baines, who coined the sort of phrase complex political perpetrators. In both instances, their work is really trying to encourage researchers and other kinds of professionals to approach atrocity-affected people as whole people whose existence and identity is determined by more than their experience of genocide, and allows us to then also recognize simultaneously the impressive and at times very powerful agency that conflict-affected people can exercise in adopting and or resisting labels such as survivor and perpetrator and so on. Even while, you know, they recognize the necessity of negotiating what the feminist anthropologist Begonia Arxaga and others have termed choiceless decisions around conflict. In centering the complexity of people's lived experiences and the political climates, of course, in which they are embedded when these atrocities are happening, but also in the aftermath of these atrocities, alongside then critical analysis of the narratives that they share with us, we can begin to create space to address the common and often consistent role shifting that people engage in surrounding genocides and other kinds of mass atrocities. And the hope then is that in the process, we can begin to promote a more nuanced understanding of these atrocities that better reflects the lived experiences of the people who endure them from all different sides of the conflict. So it's really allowing us just to kind of open up and create space for considering people more sort of holistically. To be clear, this approach does not advocate for regarding all people's actions in these contexts as morally or legally equivalent. So that is not what I'm trying to push for here. Indeed, you know, it really necessitates a very sensitive approach, one that involves very careful political, historical, and legal contextualization. And especially, I would say, when working with the often very intimate information that people share with us as part of their life histories and as part of their accounts of experiencing and in other ways engaging in genocidal violence. But carefully applied, I think it can offer a really useful starting point for analyzing this full spectrum of people's actions during mass atrocities, and allows us to then produce a more comprehensive and informed view of the extensive role shifting that can occur, that pushes back against the overly simplistic and sometimes harmful narratives and archetypes of genocidal action that tend to arise in the aftermath of mass atrocities, and I think especially in sort of popular culture representations. So to kind of dig into then the value of this approach in this edited volume, I then sort of focus in on the 1994 Rwandan genocide, which in official parlance is known as the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. I'm drawing in this chapter on almost 15 years now of experience conducting oral historical and ethnographic research with Rwandans who in the genocide's aftermath came to be identified sometimes by themselves, but often by other people around them, according to one of three strictly delineated archetypes that persist in Rwanda at the present. First being a kind of innocent survivor, the second being the heroic combatant, and then the third being the guilty perpetrator. And just to give you a little bit of context behind how these terms work in Rwanda, typically the term victim is reserved for people who are murdered, disappeared, or harmed irreparably to the point where they're no longer able to kind of care for themselves. So it's a very specific type of person who tends to be referred to as a victim. And of course, this is a term as well that, because of this official parlance around the genocide against the Tutsi, tends to be applied then, in at least a public context, only to people of Tutsi heritage. The term survivor then is seen as very distinct from that of victim in most circumstances, referencing Tutsi civilians who either experienced the genocide firsthand or who lost family members. They were maybe living abroad, for example, but their extended families were wiped out during the genocide and so on. And once again, then the way that the term survivor typically gets used, it sort of obscures the possibility of Hutu and Tutsi survivors of the genocide. It's a term that's really very much reserved for Tutsi, people of Tutsi heritage. The terms combatant and ex-combatant then are typically reserved for people who fought alongside the Rwandan Patriotic Army, the RPA, which is the military wing of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a predominantly Tutsi political party that today, is the sort of most powerful political party in Rwanda, makes up the majority of the Rwandan government. In instances where people have then been sort of incorporated into the Rwandan Defense Forces, which is the Rwandan military today, they're referred to as combatants, but where they've been demilitarized and moved into other areas of work and so on, they're often referred to as ex-combatants. And it's particularly interesting because while these people often engaged in violence, they're often regarded as heroes in the Rwandan official history today, even where it's recognized that they may have engaged in crimes against humanity and war crimes against Rwandan civilians, either prior to the Rwandan genocide during the civil war that started in 1990, during the genocide or in the aftermath. These atrocities have largely been explained as the actions of individuals who were extremely psychologically distressed by the atrocities that were perpetrated during the genocide. And so any atrocities they might have then engaged in by themselves were the result of this extreme distress. And so very rare, never part of, say, a government or military strategy. And for this reason, then, the heroism of combatants and ex-combatants is really stressed in Rwanda at present. And they are, of course, then regarded as completely distinct from the génocidaires, which is the Kinyarwandan term that is used today in reference to people who perpetrated genocide-related crimes. And of course, then this is used sort of interchangeably with the term perpetrators in the Rwandan context. And so while there are in Rwanda today very, very clearly delineated categories of actors which are used, in all elements of the public sphere when talking about the genocide, what I found particularly interesting throughout my own research is that I encountered very few, if any, Rwandans who regarded themselves or others in their community as sort of neatly fitting into these categories. And so this opened up then all sorts of conversation about the ways in which people maybe didn't fit neatly or moments where they had and so on. To sort of dig into this a bit further then, in the handbook, I'm exploring in detail the life histories of 3 individuals with whom I conducted multiple interviews over the space of about 8 months to demonstrate the relevance of sort of considering in greater detail this idea of role shifting that can occur in mid-genocides. So whereby people are moving between or engaging simultaneously in actions that can cross the perceived boundaries between these delineated categories of victim, survivor, bystander, combatant, perpetrator, and so on. I speak about 3 different individuals, the first being a young man who's a survivor of the genocide and of Tutsi heritage, the second being an ex-combatant who fought alongside the Rwandan Patriotic Army during the Civil War and genocide, and then the third being a convicted perpetrator who was found guilty of perpetrating atrocities during the genocide. Due to time constraints, obviously I'm not going to go into all 3 of these life histories in detail in this presentation, but I just for a few moments wanted to focus on one individual that I highlight in this chapter, a young man named Innocent who had been a child at the time of the genocide, and whose extended family was nearly obliterated during the genocide. Innocent himself was directly targeted by Hutu power extremists despite being a child, and of course he was too young to adequately defend himself. So he was nearly killed multiple times during the genocide. And in many ways, I mean, his narrative, his experiences, this is somebody you would expect to clearly fit this archetype of the innocent genocide survivor. But in having time to talk about how he survived the genocide on his own terms, Innocent also acknowledged that he was very uncomfortable with this idea of himself being an innocent genocide survivor, that he had done many, many things during this period of which he really wasn't proud. And in particular, that he found very difficult to discuss due to the shame he associated with these actions. Most notably, Innocent talked about how after he'd been separated from the adults in his life, he joined a group of street kids whom he convinced he was Hutu, basically told them that his family had been attacked by the Hutu power extremists by accident. And once he was then accepted into his community, into their community, he was then assumed by outsiders to be Hutu. This afforded him a certain degree of protection, but also meant then that he was increasingly prompted to engage in this kind of choiceless decision-making that ultimately led him to engage in a range of criminal actions to ensure his survival. And so, for example, he ended up, stealing food and clothes from people, including genocide survivors, people who he knew were survivors. And in one instance as well, then got into detail about having been with these street kids at roadblocks where they were participating in the killing of other Tutsi, sometimes demonstrating great enthusiasm when they encountered a Tutsi individual that they regarded as having been too proud or ungenerous toward them. And I didn't ask Innocent if he participated in these atrocities, because it seemed a very painful subject for him to discuss, and I wanted to respect the silence he was maintaining around these details. But he did subsequently admit that he did everything he could to convince the street kids that he was one of them, which I sort of took then as an indirect admission that he had likely witnessed and certainly been a kind of situated bystander to these murders, if not a direct participant himself. And these kinds of then really, really complex narratives, people being survivors but also having engaged in atrocities or having committed other kinds of crimes, this is something I often encountered among survivors that I was interviewing. And it often then, when they talked about these things, it was recounted in a way that made them feel very, very shamed, and often then sort of intermingled with the broader psychological and emotional stress that they were navigating related to the genocide. It was clearly very significant for them that they had engaged in these kinds of crimes, and contributed to a sense often of survivor's guilt and other kinds of social distress. In Innocent's case, this had actually left him quite suicidal. And even though, he went on in his life to become a primary caregiver for a lot of other children who'd lost loved ones during the genocide and went on to work as well with the Survivors Organization, his work was often celebrated in this context because he was so remarkably empathetic and working with other vulnerable people. And yet for Innocent, he often found then that this label of himself as a kind of an innocent survivor, its connotations of moral superiority and so on, really at times negatively affected him, given the reality that he had lived through during the genocide. And so for this reason, in terms of his sort of post-genocide mental health, he often sort of acknowledged that the psychological weight of his cumulative actions during the genocide seemed to exacerbate the negative effects of the extraordinary genocidal violence that he'd actually endured himself at the hands of Hutu power extremists. So it's very, very significant for him on a personal level. And so just to sort of briefly conclude then, well, I think there are clear cases of, in some instances, of people who really do fit these categories of the kind of innocent survivor, heroic ex-combatant, guilty perpetrator, and so on. I think it's important to stress that for many Rwandans, they really understand that their actions and those of their compatriots were often much more complicated than these labels allow for. And at times that these labels, using them, can actually be painful for people, given, the political and social capital that's associated with them. Unfortunately, for many Rwandans, there's very little space in Rwanda at present to discuss this kind of role shifting in a meaningful way in public contexts. But given that they live in densely populated, tightly knit communities in the post-genocide period, they're often still, nonetheless, very much aware of the complexities of these of survival of the genocide and other kinds of action. And in being kind of committed then to try to avoid future bloodshed within the country, this is something that comes up again and again and again, the need to recognize the complexity of what people went through as being something that could be a very, very powerful way to promote social repair within the country, even though they simultaneously recognize how enormously challenging it would be for them to do so. And in a lot of ways, then, I think what Rwandans are struggling with in these kinds of instances is very reminiscent of Kirsten Dowdy's work on Rwanda, where she talks about the challenges of social repair in this kind of context, being sort of suffused with hostility and instrumentality, and that it's never easy or painless. This is always going to be really hard and emotionally provocative work. And so I think I'm just out of time, so I'll conclude there. But of course, I invite questions and comments in the discussion period toward the end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jassy. We have one last presentation, and we have some fantastic questions coming in the chat. So I please encourage folks to to continue to type your questions in the chat. And our last presentation is Dr. Kjell Anderson. He's actually the last chapter in the handbook, the 37th chapter, and it's a fantastic chapter to end on. So the end of the handbook looks at different atrocity crimes and really dives into case studies. And we've broken them up into war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, even though we fully recognize that often these crimes are occurring simultaneously. And I think this last one is particularly important because it looks at the genocide against the Yazidi. And of course, as we're going to hear, this is a genocide perpetrated by a non-state actor. And I think many of our theories and models are really not attuned to non-state actors engaging in this violence, particularly those that look at forecasting and understanding genocide. So with this, I will turn it over to our final presenter, and please continue with questions in the meantime.
Thank you very much, Holly, and hello, everybody. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm at the University of Manitoba, which is on the traditional lands of the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Anishinaabe, and the Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So it's very nice to be back at the IAGS. I have no PowerPoint either, like Erin. I wish we could meet in person, but unfortunately, circumstances don't permit, but I would like to thank the organizers for the fantastic work they've done, as well as the editors of the handbook. Thanks for organizing this and for having us contribute to the book as well. So I'll be presenting my chapter on the Yazidi genocide, as Holly said. It's still a lesser known case, I would say. It's a very contemporary case. Although I think that will change. I think in the next few years, there will certainly be more research to come. There will also be more cases before courts in terms of the Yazidi genocide and crimes against humanity. So in 2014, the Islamic State committed a systematic campaign of violence against the Yazidi or Yazidi religious group within their traditional homelands in northern Iraq. This campaign involved multiple methods of violence, including killing, forced displacement, forced conversion, forced marriage, and the destruction of cultural property. In my presentation today, I'm going to focus on the violence and how we can characterize that violence. My chapter is broader than my presentation because it's longer, of course. So in my chapter, I also delve into other themes like more background on the Yazidi themselves and the kind of historical background, as well as on accountability, which I'm not talking about too much today. So a really important point here is that the violence against the Yazidi cannot be understood just in terms of killing. And sometimes we see in popular media, genocide is very much kind of reduced to just killing in terms of destruction. But in the Yazidi genocide, the gendered dimensions of the violence are really crucial to understanding what took place and to understanding the destruction, the intent to destroy, as well as the other ideologically driven practices like forced conversion and the destruction of cultural property. They reveal both pattern and purpose, which is really what we're looking for in terms of the crime of genocide. So the Yazidi, just very briefly by way of background, they're a little known group. I mean, perhaps they're better known now, but they're an old religion and they're a religious minority with a long history of persecution at the hand of other religions. And a lot of this persecution is grounded in a misapprehension or a misimpression that the Yazidi are polytheists and even devil worshippers. And this has been applied to them both by Muslims and Christians and other groups as well. So I'm going to focus specifically on the attack on Sinjar, which took place at dawn on August 3rd, 2014, when ISIS forces swept into the city of Sinjar, which is in northern Iraq. It's outside of the Kurdish regional government, but just next door. So the Sinjar region is only was only a few kilometers, I should say, from the Islamic State controlled areas of Syria. So it was quite exposed and quite vulnerable to an attack. It was targeted by the Islamic State, or ISIS, as I'm calling it in this presentation. You could also call it Daesh. There are a lot of other names. But it was targeted by ISIS for ideological reasons, because it was the homeland of the Yazidi, and the purging of Sinjar was deemed necessary to cleanse the earth of non-believers. And these non-believers, I should emphasize, don't only include non-Muslims, they also include heretical Muslims, people deemed to be heretical by the Islamic State. So in the case of Sinjar, the Peshmerga, the Kurdish paramilitaries, I suppose you could call them, or the Kurdish forces, basically withdrew right as the attack happened. So they really failed to protect the population, although there are differing versions of that. So the population was very exposed during this attack, and they had no time essentially to actually mount a defense against the Islamic State. The civilians basically fled the city in rapid succession. They fled up the mountainside into the Sinjar Mountains. In many cases, they abandoned their vehicles because they ran out of fuel or they became stuck in traffic. So it was quite a desperate kind of flight from the Islamic State forces, which swept in from multiple sides. When they reached the upper plateau of Mount Sinjar, they were then also besieged by ISIS forces. They were starved out by essentially being trapped. The population was trapped in precarious conditions. Aircraft that attempted to evacuate sick and wounded or to drop supplies were fired upon by ISIS forces. There was little shelter on this plateau from the climate and other dangers, and at least 40 children died from exposure in these early days. After the initial attack on Sinjar, ISIS's treatment of the Yazidis shifted to a new phase, focusing on its application of Islamic order as it saw it onto the population. This involved distinguishing people of the book or believers from non-believers. The Yazidi, as I mentioned, were seen as heretical, and the Islamic State really saw it as its mission essentially to convert or to essentially destroy the Yazidi, as I'll explain briefly later on in my presentation. I'll now shift to talking about the specific forms of violence that we saw during the attack on Sinjar and this broader campaign. So ISIS divided the Yazidi population, I should say the population, but most of the people in Sinjar are Yazidi. So they divided the population according to religious status, gender, and age. So it was very systematic. The Yazidi men and older boys captured by ISIS faced a stark choice, which was convert or be killed. Those who refused to convert were often or usually summarily executed. Those executions eliminated those considered a threat to ISIS while also communicating the power of the Islamic State over the population, as well as driving forced conversions. Those who converted were forced to adhere to all Islamic State tenets. They were engaging in forced labor as well. Once the Islamic State was satisfied that these men and boys had converted, which often involved tests like reciting the Quran, they were conscripted as fighters in most cases, as ISIS fighters. But from the spring of 2015 onwards, so about 8 months or so after the attack, ISIS began to reject Yazidi conversions as insincere, and many men disappeared and were essentially killed after this point. Maybe I'm stretching it a bit, but there's a bit of a historical parallel, I think, with the Nazi treatment of Jews as well. We see this rejection of conversions over time, although it happened much faster in the case of the Yazidi and the Islamic State. So there were many massacres. One of the most prominent ones was the massacre on Kucho village, which I detail in some detail in my chapter as well, including eyewitness accounts. But essentially, the village of Kucho refused to convert to Islam, and there was a large-scale massacre, especially of men and boys. So in general, older boys who were over the age of 10 were also forced to convert and subject to forced conscription to the Islamic State. Captured Yazidi women became engaged in forced marriages or sexual slavery, depending on how you want to characterize it. But they were considered to be slaves or sabaya by the Islamic State. They were considered the spoils of war. And this is kind of a term of art in terms of their specific Islamic doctrine. So it was forbidden to sell Yazidi slaves to non-Muslims, and the property rights of masters over their slaves, these women primarily, were respected. They were considered lawful property by the Islamic State. So in an interview I did with two Yazidi women who were held as sexual slaves by the Islamic State, this was in 2016, I did this interview, they recounted being moved to Syria in a meat cooler truck before being taken to a secret prison formerly used by the Assad regime. They were sold in a slave market where 4 or 5 women per night were paraded around men sitting in chairs in a humiliating and grim spectacle. One of these women told me it was like a fashion show. The men tapped their foot when they wanted to buy that one. And this institution of forced marriage was really fundamental to our understanding of whether these attacks constituted genocide, as I'll explain. The elimination of Yazidi identity also involved material destruction. So in many cases, Yazidi homes were marked during the attack, and later on they were looted or demolished. The initial attack also included the destruction of at least 10 Yazidi religious and ceremonial sites in Sinjar, with other cultural destruction to follow. So was all this genocide? I mean, what we saw was clearly patterned religious and gendered violence against the Yazidis, consisting, as I said, of killing, assault, forced conversion, enslavement, forced labor, the destruction of cultural property, etc. The scale of the violence and its discernment, the fact that it was targeted very specifically against Yazidis, and there was differential treatment to different groups within the population, this presents, in my mind, a prima facie case that the attack on Sinjar and the treatment of the Yazidis by the Islamic State was genocide, among other things, also crimes against humanity, also war crimes. The violence against the Yazidi was also large scale and organized, where thousands of people were killed and many thousands more were abducted and enslaved. The systematic forced marriage and sexual violence against Yazidi women was also in furtherance of a campaign of genocide. Yazidism requires that Yazidi children have 2 Yazidi parents. So by forcing children to adopt the identity of their new fathers, the men that these women were married to, effectively the children ceased to be Yazidi. And of course, the children born out of these illegitimate marriages were also no longer considered Yazidi, they were considered Muslim. So over time, the kidnapping of Yazidi women and girls and their subsequent forced marriage and pregnancies had the effect of ensuring that the next generation were not Yazidi, but Muslim. This is also set out systematically in the Islamic State's regulations and in their propaganda, so it's not something that happened accidentally. For example, the Bik magazine, which was one of the official propaganda outlets of the Islamic State, states that the child will be, quote, the child born out of these forced marriages will be, quote, a free man like his father, in other words, Muslim rather than Yazidi. Rape may constitute, of course, the prevention of births under Article 2D of the Genocide Convention. Forced marriage, I think, can also constitute the prevention of births as an act of genocide. ISIS's siege against Yazidi civilians in the Sinjar Mountains can also be genocide when committed with the intent to destroy. So we're looking at this as deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, whole or in part, as the Genocide Convention says. The campaign against the Yazidis was also discussed in Islamic State propaganda, and once again, it was something that was done systematically with some deliberation. So, for example, one of the Islamic State publications says, upon conquering the region of Sinjar, the Islamic State faced a population of Yazidis, a pagan minority existent for ages in the region of Iraq and Sham, or Syria. Their continual existence to this day is a matter that Muslims should question. So the destruction of the Yazidis was called for and carried out systematically by the Islamic State. So in conclusion, the Islamic State's campaign against the Yazidis constituted genocide when we consider its systematic nature, the mistreatment of the Yazidis, as well as the ideological rationale and the impact on the group. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. If I can ask all 4 presenters to come back and turn their webcams on. I'll give everyone a minute. While we're waiting for everyone to get on, again, a reminder, please type your questions in the chat. In a perfect world, I would love to be able to have someone come on and ask their question, but I think with technical difficulties in 18 minutes, it's perhaps a little bit easier if folks can type their questions and we can go person by person that way. Before we start Q&A, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Barbara Hollie was the first editor of this volume, and really the person who pulled it all together, who had done an immense amount of work, and she couldn't be here today. But I want to send out an immense amount of gratitude to her for all she did for the volume and to the ethos as we work on this and think through some questions. So with that, there's some questions that are populating in the chat. The first one that came in from Mel early on. So how about we start with Mel, if you had a chance to look at the question from Rachel. If you cannot read the chat, essentially asks about the emphasis on human rights, the emphasis that human rights regimes place on individual complaint procedures and victim standing, and asking if Mel has explored this. So I'll turn it over to Mel to address that question. Then there have been a couple of different questions for Erin, Jesse, so we can try to address those. And I see a number coming in right now about our last presentation. So if you have other questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Mel to address this first one.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rachel. I touched on it a little bit in my chapter about this difference between the systems in terms of thinking about how victims, it's not a big discussion, but I touch on it, and I think it's something that needs to be, compared a bit more, because of course in the human rights system there is a requirement that victims initially exhaust domestic procedures before they even are able to use the human rights system. So in that sense, I wasn't really addressing a lot those individual complaints mechanisms in my discussion because they are so much more complicated, but it is something that needs to be looked at more, because there is such a difference between the role of the victim in human rights processes as compared to in international criminal law processes. It has to be an individual complaint, essentially, when we're talking about human rights, because human rights, for the most part, are individual rights, with the exception of, the occasional time when peoples can make a complaint. But at the same time, when there are people's human rights, but at the same time, you would still need an individual on behalf of those people to make a complaint through the system. So it is, in a sense, much more challenging for victims to actually achieve state accountability through the human rights process, rather than thinking about individual accountability, where victims can be part of a larger group that are, represented by lawyers, essentially, this kind of third party-esque through international criminal courts and tribunals. But they have less of an individual standing. So I think it's something that would be interesting to explore a lot more, this comparison. So it's a really good question. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions that have come in for Erin, Jesse, and I can try my best to summarize them and then turn it over to Erin to address them. First, one of the questions was, I wonder if you could consider the differences between having simple categories in academia compared to, the categories on the ground, and pointing towards Dr. Weedestein's presentation about some of the difficulties that we can have if we have a number of different categories, and how we can actually compare across studies, given the complexity of categories. So that was one. And then another question in some ways went in the opposite direction and asked if your use of the language of role is in some way still reifying categories, and if people can shift roles, does that still bring these categories to the forefront in some way, rather than recognizing that they can be simultaneous and overlap and entangled. And then a third question that came in, not to hit you with all three, but just to make sure we can get through as many questions as possible, was also for Erin, and asked about, do you have reflections about how the existence or otherwise of transitional justice mechanisms or processes can influence individuals' willingness to acknowledge these complexities in themselves and others?
And go. I'll do my best to be concise. Yeah, thank you, Leslie Ann and Andrew and Rachel, for these questions. To start with Leslie Ann's question, it's mentioned, I really see this idea of a complex political actor as a starting point for trying to, dig into people's experiences and open ourselves up to the possibility that, you know, not everybody is going to fit neatly within these categories. And I fully recognize, and indeed kind of came to this conclusion in my own work, that sometimes for the sake of comparison, whether it's across different case studies or internally, like, these categories do still have a place. I mean, so I've got a whole chapter where I talk about survivors of the genocide, because that was the best way I could, in the end of the day, come up with to really do justice to what people within this category were telling me about, you know, their understanding of the genocide, for example. So yeah, I think sometimes as academics, we may choose to resort to these overly simplistic categories, but hopefully then in the work that we're doing, we're going beyond that, right? The way that we write about them and so on, we're creating room to recognize that these categories are not really nice and distinct and so on. With Andrew's question, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do agree that this idea of roles can again make it seem like these things are very, very distinct. And yeah, in that sense, can reify this separateness of, you know, we're just moving from one distinct set of categories to another. The only thing I would maybe say in response to that, though, is just, I mean, I think often in our daily lives, we're serving multiple roles at the same time. I think in using a term like role shifting, it's something a lot of people can relate to because, you know, we're caregivers, but then we're also professionals within our professional lives. You know, we can be teachers as well as researchers. So the fact that people can be serving multiple roles at the same time, you know, simultaneously, that they might overlap in different ways. I think there's maybe room for that within this idea of roles. But I mean, by all means, you know, feel free to push me on that. And then Rachel, yeah, I mean, with regards to transitional justice mechanisms, I mean, the TJ mechanisms that I focused mostly on were the memorials, genocide memorials within Rwanda. And yes, I mean, within the memorials at different memorial sites across the country, often the way that the genocide was being talked about and the way that people's actions were being talked about, again, according to these overly simplistic categories, often then people I talked to around these sites would react against them. Sometimes they agreed with them, but more often than not, they would actually sort of say, no, these categories don't work. Like, somebody could be prosecuted for genocide, but, you know, this person actually rescued me at the same time. He was committing these crimes. And, you know, we've got to be able to recognize this in how we talk about people. So yes, absolutely. There are moments, I think, with transitional justice mechanisms where you will see people making these kinds of comments. But of course, it's where they can do this, where they feel safe to make these kinds of criticisms and raise these complexities is a whole other matter. It's typically not within the transitional justice mechanisms themselves. So that was very, very brief, but I don't want to take up too much time.
That was fantastic. It's, you know, so tricky that we can't be in person to actually have a great conversation about this, but this is, you know, the best we can do. So with that, we have, I think, 5 questions that have come in for Kjell about the Yazidi genocide. So what we can perhaps do is maybe take them, you know, 3 and 2, if that sounds good to you, Kjell, and we can start with the questions that came in, maybe from Rubina, and I can try again to I'll go through maybe 3, turn it over to you, and then I can go through 2 more if that sounds good. And if folks have other questions, again, please feel free to type in the chat and we can hopefully get to them. But Rubina asked, you know, that the pattern of this genocide is a strong parallelism with the Turkish genocide of Armenians, and asked if you see Turkish involvement, since Turkey has been very much involved in the area. And Surin also chimed in and asked about Kurdish involvement as well, given Kurdish domination in the region. So that would be one question about other actors' involvement in this particular set of atrocity crimes. And then we'll add one more to this. Gregory Stanton complimented your presentation and noted that Genocide Watch is working with a coalition of Yazidi and others to find ways to essentially prosecute individuals who are accused of atrocities, and mentioned that they found an extraordinary paper based on interviews with Yazidi women about what they would consider justice for the individuals who committed crimes, and asked if you can comment on this paper, or if not, or in addition, if you have some data from your own interviews about what these individuals would consider as justice. So we'll start with those, and then we can go back to 2 additional questions that came in. And again, if others come in the chat, we'll try to get to those as well.
Okay, thanks, Hollie, and thanks for also moderating the panel. I'll try to be brief here to give time for other people to answer questions as well. So Turkish involvement and Kurdish involvement, of course, these are very thorny questions. I mean, there are parallels to the Armenian genocide. I don't see direct Turkish involvement in the campaign against the Yazidi. I mean, I don't really know. But of course, Turkey is bombing Kurds, certainly in northern Iraq. They have their own interests. Kurdish involvement, a hugely controversial question. I mean, my research was relatively limited. I didn't see any direct Kurdish involvement, but I can say that the narrative presented by the Kurdish regional government of what happened in Sinjar is not accurate. And as I was speaking to Kurdish officials, you know, the Yazidi translator came over to me at one point and he said, "Don't believe a word they're saying. It's not true. It's not what happened," which I found interesting. And other people said the same thing to me. So certainly the Peshmerga withdrew and left the Yazidi vulnerable. Whether that constitutes direct involvement is something else. So finally, this question of justice. I don't think I've read the paper in question, Greg, but it sounds like a really interesting paper. I mean, maybe you could send me an email or something. But in terms of people's impressions of justice or what they want from justice, of course, opinions vary, but I think certainly they want something to happen. I mean, there's a certain, I think you have to be careful as a foreigner, as an outsider, not to raise people's expectations unrealistically. Like, for example, people would say to me, "Can you speak to the UN Secretary General and tell him to help us?" This was in January of 2016, so the war was still very much ongoing. And of course, I told them I don't have his cell phone number, I'm afraid, though I am certainly sympathetic. So, I mean, I think they feel forgotten by the world. I think there's a lot of resentment. I mean, I think, you know, even in 2016, maybe there weren't so many researchers, but there had been many diplomats or whoever who had traipsed through there. Of course, now accountability has come away since that point, and people were genuinely feeling a bit disillusioned at that point. Maybe things have changed now. I'm not sure. I haven't been there recently.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I really appreciate the brief answers. So of course, really wish we could engage with all of this. So we had two additional questions for Kjell. One was about the term Furman, I believe. And if you've engaged with this term, as Yazidis use this term themselves as they speak about suffering. And then a last question about, you know, at what point do you think the international community failed to intervene to protect or support the Yazidi? And why do you think this happened?
Those are big questions, especially the second question. I mean, Furman, of course, is a term that's translated various ways. Some people translate it as massacre or destruction, but it's very much a part of Yazidi cultural memory, the notion of Furman, or that there have been these repeated destructions, genocides, perhaps we can call them, or massacres that have occurred over time. So this victimization and this sense of victimization is very much a part of Yazidi identity. So I can't remember if I engage with it in this chapter. I have another article with anthropologist Fazıl Muradi where I do engage with it. Sorry, what was the second question? What could have been done to stop it? Yeah, what went wrong? Well, things went wrong at every stage. I mean, of course, humanitarian aid came relatively quickly, but the Yazidi were unassisted in these very early days in terms of actually interceding or stopping the violence. And that's a failure that took place at multiple levels, from the Iraqi government, the Kurdish regional government, to, of course, the international community. I mean, it happened relatively rapidly, the initial attack, but in terms of the aftermath, very little was done. We know the UN Security Council, China and Russia are not interested in any interventions in Iraq or Syria. So that has also been a point of blockage. Also in terms of referral to the International Criminal Court. In terms of what could be done differently, I don't know if I could answer that. I want to leave time for maybe one or two more questions for the other presenters, but it's something should have been done differently. I mean, I could say that much.
All right, I believe I caught all of the questions in the chat. Did anyone see one that I missed? Okay, while we're waiting for any others to come in, or if there are no others, I can exercise my duties as moderator to throw a question out to everyone. And I'll just ask, you know, with this handbook, we're hoping that folks can use this in the classroom. So, and I know a number of the folks listening in right now are educators, so I'd be curious to hear from each of you in, you know, 45 seconds, since we have 3 minutes before the end of our session. How would you see your particular chapter being used in the classroom? Do you have any ideas about how it could be used in the classroom? And if you're okay to go in the order of presentations, and I can put Mel on the spot to start with that.
Oh, great, thanks.
No worries.
Actually, first I want to say, because obviously I'm not an editor, I haven't read any of the other papers, so this was so great, and I can't wait to see what else is in the book and read all your chapters. So, you know, this is a great opportunity to get an intro to that. I think, so the work that I've been doing on human rights, my goal is to essentially get more human rights education out to genocide scholars, because actually the word human rights is bandied around a lot by genocide scholars, but without an understanding of what human rights are and what the human rights system is and what human rights law is. So the book I'm writing is all about human rights and the genocide process, and this is kind of drawn from that, but incorporating other atrocities in it. So yeah, that's the goal, to incorporate some human rights education into genocide education as well.
So shall I take over in terms of my chapter then? Yeah, so I've had the privilege of teaching a number of students that come from a widely different backgrounds. So they have different backgrounds in terms of countries, but also in particular disciplines, law and social science and politics and history. And I think what students tend to underestimate is how lost in translation you can get, how you think you're talking about the same stuff, and then after 15 minutes you find out that really you are not. And I think sort of the chapter that I do highlights both the problems but also the opportunities that this can have. So also how to transcend those different difficulties and actually use them to your advantage. So in that sense, regardless of sort of the specific topics of dictatorship and violence, I think that can be quite illustrative and quite of a learning curve that students can have by working through the chapter. Yeah.
Wonderful. Erin, do you want to comment on this for your chapter?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm also haven't seen all of the chapters though. I've seen the table of contents and seen some of the other contributors as well. So I'm really excited about using this text in the classroom. But I think for my chapter, I mean, my hope is that it's something that students and instructors would find useful for, again, just pushing a little bit beyond these overly simplistic categories. Because I know, I mean, when I teach in Scotland what's called a special subject, which is like a year-long course on genocide that compares all sorts of different case studies and gets into, you know, about evolution of international law around these kinds of mass atrocities. And one of the challenges I often find is getting students to think about these kinds of atrocities in ways that deviate from what they'll have read in the media, what they'll have seen in Hollywood films, and these kinds of things. So yeah, I would say my hope would be that this is something that a chapter like this would contribute to.
Thank you so much. And over to Kjell for a 30-second response before we conclude.
Yeah, I mean, I think my chapter could be used by people. I think, you know, to build on what Erin was saying, I think people often misunderstand genocide as only involving mass killing, although that was certainly a part of this case as well. So I think it's useful to understand the gender dimensions and on all the dimensions that occur during genocide. And just lastly, I would also say that I hope that people do learn about this case, because I think it's perhaps already forgotten. I mean, I think there was a bit of attention in the media at the time, but certainly I know, you know, building on what I said before at the end of my presentation, or in the questions rather, that the people there, the Yazidi, very much don't want to be forgotten. And the fact that they're forgotten, I think, also contributed to their victimization and the fact that this genocide and this violence was able to happen.
Wonderful. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone else for being here. Some fantastic presentations. And I believe there's a 30-minute break for those of us who are continuing with the conference. I know for others like Mel, it's the middle of the night. So hopefully you get some sleep. But thank you all, everyone. And hopefully we'll see folks back in 30 minutes at the continuation of sessions. So thanks all, and we'll talk with you all soon.